Hello and welcome to Piano TV. So today we are going to discuss the life and times of Ludwig van Beethoven. And if you haven't heard of him, you've been living under a rock. He's one of the most famous composers of all time, and particularly the classical era, which was in the 17 and 1800s in Europe. So let's get started. Ludwig van Beethoven, who we will henceforth refer to as Ludwig, was born in Bonn in Germany in 1770 to a fairly musical family, but a commoner family. They weren't like highborns or anything. They were just like, peasants, standard peasants. And Beethoven also had two younger brothers who he was fiercely devoted to because, as you'll come to see, Beethoven, he was a family man. Sorry, Ludwig. He's Ludwig now. As was typical for the time, Ludwig's first music teacher was his father. So some people think that, he was a pretty bad teacher. They had a stressed relationship and he always made Ludwig cry at the piano. Some people say that's an unsupported claim. You can choose your own adventure here. Believe what you want to believe about Ludwig's dad. When Ludwig was 7, his dad Johann was like, hey, so there's this guy named Leopold who has these two child prodigy children, Nannerl and Wolfgang, and he tours them around Europe for lots of money. I should totally do that too. So he even lied about Ludwig's age. Ludwig was 7. The first poster said he was 6 because 7-year-olds, so washed up. When Ludwig was 16 or so, he went on a journey to Vienna to meet the famous Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. No one knows if this ever happened, so another situation where, thanks history, you kind of got to choose your own adventure. But after only being there for a couple weeks, he got word back from Bonn that his mother was really sick, so he had to go back home. His mom died, which was really unfortunate. But what was also unfortunate is that his father, Johann, who was already a problem drinker, became even more of a problem drinker when his mom died. So then Beethoven had to stay in Bonn and, his wages went towards taking care of his younger brothers because his dad was being pretty useless. So Ludwig spent 5 years in Bonn being a good, responsible teenager, doing the right thing. And he also had the opportunity to make some money friends. So a trend throughout Ludwig's life was his main way of making money was to make friends with people who had money, and they would be his patron. They would pay him to be creative. Enter Hyden, a classical composer who is maybe not as well known as Mozart or Beethoven, but just as influential at the time. So anyway, around Christmas time in 1790, Hyden was going on a tour from Vienna to London and passed through Bonn on the way. And that's where he first met Beethoven. And then a couple years later on his way back to Vienna, he was talking to Ludwig, I keep calling him Beethoven, force of habit. And they were talking and Hyden was like, hey, you should totally move to Vienna, to the big city, and I'll be your teacher and it'll be awesome. And then Ludwig was like, sweet, I'm all over that because you're a cool cat. And then in 1792, he moved to Vienna. So upon his arrival to Vienna, a couple things happened right away. So first of all, he found out that his father died, probably from being an alcoholic. Second of all, he heard that Mozart had died. So this was a really big deal at the time because, as you know, Mozart was pretty famous. And that was when Ludwig received a letter from the Count Ferdinand von Waldstein, and I quote, that said, "Through uninterrupted diligence, you will receive Mozart's spirit through Haydn's hands, I guess both of them." So at this point, the general public, as well as Ludwig himself, probably felt that he was a continuation of Mozart's spirit. So he wrote a lot of music in his early days with a Mozartian flair, and he also studied lots of Mozart as a consequence. Perhaps wisely, young Ludwig didn't get really headlong into composition until a little bit later on in his life. He really wanted to spend time mastering music and performance and theory and all that stuff before blossoming into the genius little musical flower that he was. So in 1794, his teacher Hyden went off on another London tour. So it was expected that Ludwig would go back to his hometown at Bonn, but instead he found some patrons in Vienna to help support him, so that's where he stayed. So I just want to spend a minute talking about the relationship between Hyden and Ludwig because it had its ups and downs, let's say. So one thing that happened is when Beethoven went to publish his first opus composition, Hyden was like, okay, hey, so I'm this really famous guy. Everyone loves me. Why don't you write pupil of Hyden on the music and then people are going to buy it and it's going to be well received. But Ludwig was super offended. He's like, no, I'm going to do my own thing. I don't want your stamp old man. Despite all these, personality differences, they ended up staying on good terms all the way up until Hyden's death in 1809. And at Hyden's 76th birthday party, which, hugely well-attended, giant party, Beethoven went and he was, passionately kissing Hyden's hands and forehead and being like, man, you're awesome, Hyden. So they had a rocky relationship, but they did really respect each other. Ludwig really started coming into his own and churning out the musical gems around 1798 and beyond, when he was 27 years old and later. So this is when he wrote his first few symphonies and premiered them. He wrote the famous Pathétique Sonata, he wrote some famous string quartets, and he was getting a really good reputation as a really unique and innovative composer. So his early works, as mentioned, was really influenced by Mozart and also Hyden. And you could definitely hear the influences in it, but at the same time there was enough uniqueness, especially in regards to expression and emotion, that made his works really stand out. And now for the obligatory love story, which we're all here for. At least that's what I'm here for. That's the good stuff. So Beethoven, at the time, at around 1800, he was teaching a wealthy countess and her daughters, and he fell in love with one of the daughters. Her name was Josephine, but it was a doomed love. They could never do anything about it because at the time, if you were a high-class person, you had to have a high-class suitor, and Ludwig was low-class, so no luck for him. So she was married off to some dude, and I guess they had a pretty happy relationship, all things considered, but Ludwig kept teaching her lessons, and he was just totally friend-zoned. But then, when Josephine's husband died of pneumonia in 1804, the relationship re-intensified, and he started coming over to the house, as one of Josephine's sisters noted, too often. But it's not like Josephine was in a position to just ditch everything and marry Ludwig, because she was still a high-class lady, and she was in the really uncomfortable position of, she had high-class children. So if she were to give everything up and run away with Ludwig, she would basically be relieving custody of her children. So not really a hard decision to make. I think, Josephine, you chose your kids over your lover, so that was probably a good call. So if you know anything about Ludwig van Beethoven, you probably know that he was famous for going deaf, which is a really crappy thing to be famous for, but that's what happened. When he was in his late 20s, he started experiencing hearing loss, thought to be a severe form of tinnitus, which is basically like a loud ringing in his ears. And he was writing to some of his friends about the problems he was experiencing professionally, obviously as a musician, but also personally, and he was avoiding conversations and stuff like that just because he couldn't hear them and he felt socially awkward. Ludwig's doctor recommended that Ludwig take some time off for several months to contemplate his situation and, deal with everything. And he went to Heiligenstadt. Did I pronounce that right? Anyways, he was really unhappy. Go figure, he's going deaf, he's a musician. Clearly he's very depressed. He wrote to his brothers about feeling suicidal, but at the end of his trip, he was like, you know what? No, I'm gonna keep living and be awesome because I'm a musician and I love my art and I'm gonna keep doing this. Because of his growing deafness, he lost his ability to perform. So in 1811, he failed to even perform one of his own concertos. So from that point on, he was like, nope, no more. I'm done performing. I'm not going to embarrass myself like this anymore. But he did end up conducting his Ninth Symphony in 1824. But apparently, he had to be turned around physically by someone so he could see the roaring applause of the audience. And he couldn't even hear the symphony itself either. So Carl Czerny ended up saying that Beethoven was more or less completely deaf by 1815 or so, but he did happen to have the best friends in the universe, so they used things called conversation books to have conversations. So his friends would write down something in a book so Ludwig knew what they were saying, and then Ludwig would respond either actually speaking, or he would write something down too, so good friends of his. So after Ludwig returned from Heiligenstadt for his me time, he was a new man. He commented to Czerny, I am not happy with the music I've made up until now, so I'm gonna take a new way. He had a new fervor, a new passion for art. And this is when he started writing some really big and bold compositions, such as the Third Symphony called Eroica, the Fifth Symphony, and so on. So it was this phase in his career that really cemented him as a master composer of life. Ludwig's life was a roller coaster. And, you know, with its ups and downs, I don't think I needed to spell that out for you. But when he was in his early 40s, after being really ill for a couple years and like refusing to die, as was his norm, he ended up being like pretty depressed. He was taking care of his brother who had tuberculosis, and he was really close with his brother, so that was super sad. And he stopped taking care of his physical appearance. He like looked all wild and disheveled and acted bad in public, not giving a crap what other people thought about him. So yeah, he had some hard times. He was also composing some masterpieces, so there were ups. And so now we return to the famous Ninth Symphony, Beethoven's last symphony, his final public performance, and one that was raved about. The one that he couldn't hear, though. It was kind of sad. So Carl Czerny, good friend, student Carl Czerny, he said about that one, breathed such a fresh, lively, indeed youthful spirit, with so much power, innovation, and beauty as ever came from the head of this original man, although he certainly sometimes led the old wigs to shake their heads. And that leads us to Beethoven's death. Inevitably, it's got to happen. So even though he was really sick for a lot of his life and he was going deaf since his 20s, he had the life force of a boss. He just did not die. He got really, really sick in 1825, didn't die. Got sick in 1826, then he didn't die. And he, you know, kept writing lots of works in this time. So he kind of had some like health upswings and downswings and so on until he finally died in 1827, apparently during a thunderstorm. Apparently at the moment of his death, there was a loud thunderclap because this is Beethoven we're talking about, of course. He died during a thunderstorm with a loud thunderclap. Ludwig had a huge funeral with something like 20,000 Viennese people visiting his funeral, including Schubert, who sadly would die the next year and be buried beside Beethoven. So yeah, that's kind of too bad. So there's several theories what caused him to die. One of them being he was poisoned by lead, which might have been through medicine that his doctor was giving him. His liver was apparently damaged, so it could have been complications related to alcoholism. Again, we don't really know, it was too long ago, but choose your own adventure. So clearly, if we've learned anything, Ludwig had this like super strong and passionate personality, and that's probably what people loved about him, among other things. He was also able to handle some really severe adversity, and you know, being sick most of his life, the fact that he managed to live into his 50s, producing some of the greatest works of the classical era, that says a lot about the strength of his character. And it also speaks to us about how awesome he was as a person as well as a composer, just by how huge of a devoted circle of friends he had. So that's it for Ludwig. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to keep up to date with other videos of this, subscribe, and check out the blog pianotv.net. Thank you, and see you next time. Beethoven's life was a roller coaster after having... Let's try this again. Ludwig's life... No, okay, I can't say it like that. Okay. Oof.